Before we begin, I'd just like to say thank you for watching my videos. If you are new to the channel, please consider becoming a patron. Just click the link in the video description below to be taken to my Patreon page. It's a great way to help support my channel and gain access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content and uncensored videos. Now, please relax and enjoy the creepy stories. This incident happened when I was 16 years old. I grew up the youngest of 5 siblings, 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters. I was the last one still living at home, as my nearest older sibling had just recently moved out. We grew up in a large, old, turn-of-the-century home in a wooded area on a sparsely populated hillside. The home overlooked a dirty, dying steel mill that was surrounded by a labyrinth of old, dilapidated railroad tracks that were often frequented by sketchy transients and disheveled hobos. It was a 4-bedroom house, with 3 of the bedrooms upstairs and only 1 bedroom downstairs. For most of the time we had lived there, I had always occupied one of the upstairs bedrooms adjacent to my parents' room. There was no written rule on bedroom ownership amongst us kids, but it was always agreed upon that the oldest sibling would get the downstairs bedroom, which provided more independence and privacy. Well, since I was now the only child left in the house, I triumphantly moved all my stuff down into my new downstairs living space. I was feeling both excited and a little more grown up to finally get my turn at the best room. My older siblings, for the most part, had all shared a variation of similar experiences of their own time in this room. They pretty much agreed it was the best room in the house. But there were occasionally some things about it that could be a little unsettling. It soon became apparent to me what they were referring to. One of my first nights in the new room, I was laying in bed when I heard what I thought were strange sounds coming from the basement. It sounded almost like a digging or scratching noise coming from deep in the belly of the house. The stairs leading down to this unfinished dwelling just happened to be behind a door that was located inside my new bedroom. I'm not gonna lie, I always try to put on a brave face when confronted with disturbing unpleasantries, but I'm not afraid to admit, our basement was creepy as hell. It was a dark, antiquated, and musty place. For some reason, literally half of the basement was filled up with huge mounds of dirt, about 6 feet high. These dirt heaps extended all the way to the far wall of the house. Us kids used to always joke that one of the previous families that lived there before us probably had bodies buried under those earthen mounds. For some reason, those macabre discussions always made me think of the psychotic serial killer, John Wayne Gacy, the literal clown who had horrifically buried 30 bodies under his own house. And it didn't help that one of my older brothers had once pulled what looked like a large femur bone out of one of the exposed dirt piles. We never bothered to have it analyzed. We just assumed it was from some type of animal, maybe an old family pet, or some long-ago buried dog treasure. We would even occasionally crack a morbid joke about its true origins, and then pretend to ourselves that we were positive there was nothing really sinister about it. But in the back of our minds, I think we always wondered. Well, after tossing and turning for what seemed like hours, and then trying everything I could to block out or ignore these unnerving sounds, I finally got up the courage to take a peek down into the narrow stairway leading to this unwelcoming pit. I noisily got out of bed and deliberately tromped over to the door, hoping that the extra ruckus I had to make on the floorboards would somehow scare off whatever or whomever was making the strange noises beneath me. When I finally got to the door, I slowly slid back the flimsy slide latch, the only physical mechanism between me and the dark stairwell. As I gradually opened the door, just a crack, and hesitantly peeked inside, a wave of relief settled over me. I realized that my dad had previously put a thick plastic sheet over the whole doorway in order to keep out the cold draft. My father was a frugal, former Midwestern guy who, every year, would put up a clear plastic sheeting over all of our outside windows and some doors in order to save on the energy bill. So, when I saw this freshly covered plastic barrier blocking the doorway, I was relieved that now I actually had an excuse why I wouldn't have to go down and check out these strange sounds. The only other way to the basement was to go outside and around the house to the big oversized door that sealed it from the elements. This huge door was regularly left unlocked. Even if you wanted to, the only way you could actually lock it was from the outside with a padlock. And since the kitchen appliances were always tripping a circuit and the breaker box was in the basement, it rarely got locked because of the constant resetting of the breaker. Well, I finally fell asleep that night and didn't have any more problems with unexplained sounds for about a month or so. Then, one night, and it just so happens with my parents out of town for a family funeral, and me all alone at home in my bed, I started hearing, once again, some strange scratching sounds coming from the basement. After having mentioned to my parents about the previous noises I had heard, they had assured me that they themselves had sometimes seen a stray cat coming out of the basement through the not quite fully closed large outside door. Thinking about what they had told me made me feel a lot better about this current episode. But as I lay there this evening, the noises seemed to be much louder and closer to my bedroom door than ever before. And I even thought that I had heard the unmistakable sound of squeaking stairs and the scratching of plastic. It must be the stray cat, I convinced myself. Fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, I was extremely tired that night, and I was able to block out the noises and shut down my racing mind enough to drift off to sleep. I'm not sure what it was, because the house was extremely quiet, but I woke up in the middle of the night with a dreadful feeling. I don't know exactly why, but remembering the noises earlier that evening, I decided to get out of my warm, safe bed and make my way across the cold floor to the door leading to the basement. As I approached the door, I was filled with what I thought was an irrational sense of fear, since the last time I had heard the noises it turned out to be nothing. So, moving with fake confidence in the mistaken belief that it would once again be nothing more than my active imagination, I walked over to the menacing door. I steeled my nerves, grabbed firmly onto the doorknob, and yanked it completely open with a reassurance that only came from the certainty of my last experience. The first thing I noticed that was different from the previous incident was the immediate sensation of rushing cold air that swept over my exposed skin and bare feet. I stood there stunned, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The previously pristine covered plastic that my dad had installed looked like it had been stolen from the set of a horror movie. The plastic had numerous slash marks cut completely through it, running from the top of the door frame to the bottom of the door jamb. I stood there frozen for what seemed like minutes, but I now know could only have been seconds. I quickly got my senses about me and slammed the door shut and locked it as fast as my body was able. I ran a full sprint out of my room and out onto the front balcony overlooking the huge door that seals the basement from the outside world. Peering down to the ground level, even in the darkness of the late evening, early morning, my trembling body could make out what I had hoped I would never see. The heavy basement door was wide open. From my vantage point, I could also make out what looked like a large, dark figure moving quickly down the hill toward the old steel mill's barbed wire fence. I watched as the shadow appeared to have gone straight through the fence and then disappeared along the railroad tracks. I immediately ran out of the house and down to the basement door, where I quickly slammed it shut and snapped closed the padlock. I then ran back into the house, making sure all the doors and windows were locked tight. I found my Louisville Slugger in a hall closet and then moved quickly to turn on every single light in the house. Predictably, I did not go back to sleep that night. When my parents finally returned home, they themselves could not think of any logical explanation for what had happened. Although they would never admit it, I think the shredded plastic even freaked them out a little bit. This was evidenced by the fact that my dad soon became a personal gun owner. My parents discussed making a police report, but for some reason decided against it. Needless to say, in the time that I still lived there, the basement door was never again left unlocked. And shortly after I had finally moved out, my parents sold the place. Although our family no longer owns the house, I will always own the memory of that nightmarish evening. It was late 1991 or early 1992. I was about 24 years old, and my little sister was about 15. I was in Waterloo, Iowa, with my 1-year-old son, visiting my dad, stepmom, and younger siblings. It was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and my dad was waiting for my little sister and I out front of my papa's house. That's our grandfather, Papa. He actually lived next door to my dad. Anyway, my dad and my little sister were taking my son and I to the airport for our flight back to Seattle, but I wanted to say goodbye to Papa first. My little sister and I asked Dad to wait while we ran around the back of the house into my Papa's always unlocked back kitchen door. We accidentally let the screen door slam, which was a big no-no when Grandma was alive. She had been gone almost a year now, probably closer to 9 months at this point. Emphysema. Still, my little sister and I both cringed at the sound. We passed through the tiny kitchen into the large formal dining room, through the huge double-wide doorway, and into the living room. And there, on the couch, was the ghost of my grandmother. She was sleeping on the couch, where she used to always take her naps, on her side with both her hands under her head, just as she used to do when she was still alive. Her outline, the color of a candle's flame, rose quickly to a seated position. My sister and I both saw it, looked at each other wide-eyed, and slammed the dining room light on, and she was gone. We then ran through the living room, past where she had been on the couch, and up the stairs to say goodbye to Papa. We said our goodbyes, then went down the first part of the stairs, just to the landing where the stairs make a 90-degree turn. We just stood there on the landing for a minute, getting our nerve up before looking. I told my little sister, If she's still there when we get to the dining room, run. We ran downstairs, through the living room, and into the dining room, trying not to look. We got to the dining room, shut the light back off to see if she would reappear, and there she still was. We screamed bloody murder and ran out of there as fast as our legs could carry us, back around the front of the house and into the warmth of my dad's car, where we got in, locked the doors, and tried to calm our breathing while our dad was clearly disturbed, asking us, "Oh my God, what is wrong with you guys?" We tried to explain to him what we saw, but he was having none of it. He was pretty upset at the thought of us mocking our dead grandmother, which is the way it sounded like he was taking it. We never really brought it up to him again, because it was obviously a sore subject. Since my sister and I live halfway across the country from each other, we never really discussed it further either. Until she was about 18 in high school and had to write a paper that told of an unforgettable experience. This was the story she picked. She emailed the story to me, and it was exactly as I remembered, every detail. Is it even possible for two people to share the same delusion? I don't think so. Furthermore, my dad had told me that Papa would sit at the dining room table every morning, talking to himself, ever since Grandma died. My dad knew this because he could see directly into Papa's dining room window from his kitchen. As I said, they were next-door neighbors, and their houses were just a mere few feet apart. I'm pretty sure it was a real ghost, because I had seen one other ghost a few times before who had the same exact candle flame-colored outline when I was about 6 years old in my grandma's house. But that's another story for another time. I was a recently divorced father of 2 young kids, a rambunctious little girl and her younger, mellower brother, when I moved into what I thought was a nice, quaint townhouse in the Pacific Northwest. By all outward appearances, there was nothing unusually creepy or sinister looking about the place. It was in a decent suburban neighborhood surrounded by other similar townhomes, interspersed with the occasional cluster of evergreen trees that towered majestically around the community. The home had an upstairs with 2 bedrooms and an adjoining bathroom. The downstairs consisted of a kitchen, bathroom, and a small dining room with an adjacent living room. It looked like it was going to be the perfect, peaceful place for a joint custody father to take up residence. But its looks were unfortunately deceiving. No sooner had I settled in when strange things began to happen. I worked the late shift, and the kids were with their mother most times during the work week. When I would come home late after work, I started noticing that from the moment I walked in the front door and entered the dark hallway, a loud clanking noise would emanate from the upstairs bathroom. At first, I would nervously and quietly creep up the stairs to determine what and from whom this sound may have been originating. I was almost expecting an unwelcome confrontation with someone in my home, but thankfully, there was never anyone there. I soon realized that the recurring noise was the heavy porcelain back lid to the toilet tank somehow lifting itself up, what must have been an inch or so in height, and dropping itself back down with a large, unmistakable clank. This would happen every single time I came home late into the house, except for on the occasions when I came home with someone else. It was almost as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. Other unsettling things started happening soon after. There were times when I would be alone and standing up using that same toilet to relieve myself when I would suddenly feel a cold chill emanating from behind me, until I could almost feel it absorbing into me, sending unnatural shivers throughout my whole body. That was the first time that I had the overwhelming feeling that this spirit, or whatever it was of an older, deceased woman. Shortly thereafter, my fiancé would stay with me regularly and became witness to some of these same unexplained events. As a matter of fact, we would regularly discuss this female entity aloud when we were alone in the house and the children were not with us. We would often do it in hushed whispers, as if the apparition might be somehow listening in on us. We were soon to realize dramatically that this entity always seemed to be listening. One night alone with just the two of us, and late in the evening, we were sitting quietly downstairs getting ready to watch a movie. We, unfortunately, made the mistake of discussing what unnatural thing this female apparition would do next to try and disrupt our evening or to try and get our attention. No sooner had we mentioned and acknowledged out loud her unwelcome presence, one of the children's toy fire trucks came forcefully flying down the long flight of stairs, crashing furiously into the wall at the bottom of the landing. We sat in stunned silence. Another night, we were alone laying in bed, once again late at night with the room pitch black, and we were just talking quietly to each other. We had been laying there for maybe an hour or so, with not a sound except for the hushed sounds of our own voices. Regrettably, one of us decided to quietly mention aloud the older deceased woman again. No sooner had the acknowledgement of her been made, an unmistakable noise arose out of the completely silent home. From behind the closed bathroom door, we heard the squeaking of a knob turning on the bathroom sink. Then the unmistakable sound of gushing water. I said to my fiancé, "Are you hearing what I'm hearing?" Her answer was an unequivocal and equally nervous yes. I slowly got out of bed, walked a couple of feet to the bathroom door, and hesitantly opened it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I observed the hot water from the bathroom faucet gushing out full blast into the sink basin. Once again, there were no words. There were many more incidents that had happened over our time in that eerie place, which would probably take more time than would be appropriate for this short recital. Looking back, I am grateful for what appears to be a mothering virtue of this physically manifesting entity. She never exhibited any physical manifestations while the children were present in the home. If she had, we would have moved out much sooner. As it was, we did end up moving out shortly afterward, and were, mercifully, never bothered again by this unwanted spirit. On rare occasions, I would slowly drive by the old townhouse, peering up to the closed dark window shades of the strange dwelling. I was almost reluctant to get too close to the place, for, I'm sure, an irrational fear of somehow being spotted by some desperate and possibly mobile entity. Fortunately, those fears never materialized, and I have since just decided to leave well enough alone.